So, like the rest of the world, I saw Longlegs this week, and I actually really liked it. I try to watch as many new horror releases as I can, and I know this film was very, very hyped, but I thought the film's horror elements were actually very effective. I loved the cinematography, and I thought it was great. It pleased me. But that being said, there's one thing that kind of stuck out to me while watching the film that kind of hit me right away. Why is Longlegs kind of gay? I'm definitely not the first person to have said this. I know that it's like a huge discussion topic surrounding the film on Twitter right now. Some people being like, it's a reach, you're actually being like transphobic by saying it. And other people being like, no, it's so Silence of the Lambs coded, etc. So I thought today we'd kind of maybe just take a look into some of the criticisms, some of the history of queerness and horror, and kind of unpack this question. Is Longlegs gay, and does it matter? So going into the film and seeing the character of Longlegs, I was kind of taken aback, I guess just by Nick Cage's representation of the character with the big pouty lips, the plastic surgery, the long hair, and the androgynous clothes. As a longtime fan of horror who's kind of like familiar with all these tropes and who studied a lot of queer horror, I was kind of just prepared for like a super transphobic hour-and-a-half long romp. Now, some of you might be thinking that I'm jumping the gun. Like, Emma, just someone having like pouty lips, plastic surgery, dressing androgynous, and having long hair doesn't mean they're queer. And yes, I understand where you're coming from. A lot, like I said before, people on Twitter are kind of like, it's transphobic to think that. It's transphobic to be like, this character who's kind of horrific looking is dressing like this. It reminds me of a trans woman. And I totally get where people are coming from with that criticism. One criticism that I don't really understand as much is the one where people are being like, Longlegs is just glam rock. As if glam rock isn't like the gayest shit ever. Like, extremely queer coded. But anyways, while the film and the character of Longlegs are not in any way explicitly queer, the film is very much influenced by other films that have kind of used some of these transphobic tropes. So let's just take a brief minute to kind of look into the history of trans representation and queer representation in the horror genre. The history of transphobia in horror is just like so far-reaching. Maybe one of the most famous early examples of this would be in the year 1960 with Alfred Hitchcock's film Psycho, which portrays Norman Bates, a man who runs a hotel who cross-dresses as his mother and kills innocent young women. Norman Bates' transness is understood as a symptom of mental illness. His personality split between his male counterpart and his murderous mother. At the end of the film Sleepaway Camp, it's revealed that one of the film's main characters and the serial killer, this young girl named Angela, is actually a trans woman. In Silence of the Lambs, Buffalo Bill is a queer-coded cross-dresser who skins his female victims and wears their skin as kind of like a costume to cross-dress, I guess. Now, the thing about these films is that none of these characters are actually like explicitly trans or like trans by choice. Like, this kind of transness says more, I guess, about their state of mental health or how they've been victims of abuse, and less so about their actual gender identity. Buffalo Bill, for example, is like canonically in the films and the movie explicitly not trans. They even say so in Silence of the Lambs in a way that's kind of like really transphobic.
Billy is not a real transsexual, but he thinks he is. He tries to be. He's tried to be a lot of things, I expect.
And similarly, in Sleepaway Camp, it's revealed at the end of the film that while Angela is trans, she was forced at a young age to be trans by her mother, who always wanted a daughter and really forced her to present as femme. While we have no real way of really knowing how Angela actually identifies, if she is comfortable with her own transness, the fact that the movie is just about like this character who's forced to be trans and then murders a bunch of people kind of speaks to Angela's stance on her transness, maybe? But that's my take. Either way, her transness stems from a place of abuse rather than her kind of coming to terms with her own gender identity.
I'm transgender.
And while all of these films were written and directed by cis men, feminist horror texts have been almost like equally problematic when it comes to talking about representations of trans bodies in horror. In Her Body Himself, Carol Clover describes the killer in slasher films as being inherently male. She writes, quote, "The killer's phallic purpose as he thrusts his drill or knife into the trembling bodies of young women is unmistakable. At the same time, however, his masculinity is severely qualified. He ranges from the virginal or sexually inert to the transvestite or transsexual, and is spiritually divided, the mother half of his mind, or even equipped with a vulva or vagina," end quote. So I think we can all take a second to just agree that this text is super dated. It's pretty problematic, but that being said, it's still like one of the most influential and still talked about feminist horror texts to this day. Like, I mean, like, it coined the term final girl, a term which we still use all the time. It's still such a trope in horror, which Carol Clover didn't invent this character, but the language used in this text are still often used today. And I think that it's not often understood that these ideas come from such a place of rampant transphobia. The gender essentialism of Clover's text leaves very little room for nuance. The phallus is a knife, which intrudes the dark corridors of the female victim's home. So now that we've just gone through like this super brief history and understanding of transphobia within the horror genre, at least from the standpoint of like very popular films and this very popular and influential text, let's now take a moment to look at the director, Osgood Perkins, and kind of just see his intentions with the film and kind of how he sees the character, because I think the director's intentions here are very important. So Perkins has actually stated in interviews that the film was actually very much influenced by Silence of the Lambs, something that I know like a lot of people on Twitter don't really believe or want to believe, but it's true, sorry. And even, I feel like even if Perkins didn't explicitly say this, it's like super evident. Like, how are you going to tell me that a film in which like a young FBI agent is hunting down this killer who kind of presents a little more androgynous is not based on Silence of the Lamb? I think another fact that is very under-discussed and honestly super important is the fact that Osgood Perkins is in fact the son of Anthony Perkins, who portrays Norman Bates in Psycho. And besides his portrayal of this super historically famous queer-coded character, Anthony Perkins himself was actually in the closet, a fact that came to light after his death from HIV/AIDS in 1992. Perkins' wife Barry was very much aware of this, keeping his secret until his untimely death. Osgood Perkins is very open about the fact that Longlegs was, at least to some extent, based on the experience he had growing up with his father. I mean, like, think about it. Lee Harker's mother is keeping Longlegs in the basement, keeping his secret from Lee and the rest of the world until his death. I think it's pretty clear the connections here between Perkins' actual life and the film. This is actually super interesting to me because I think even more so than the connections to Silence of the Lambs, Perkins' family history and his openness about it really answer a lot of questions I had about this character Longlegs' kind of more vague queerness. Now, that being said, does this make the portrayal of the character in relation to the history of transphobia and horror any less harmful? No, not necessarily. In all the cases we spoke about before, like Psycho, Silence of the Lambs, and Sleepaway Camp, whether these characters can actually be read as queer or not, they're being read as queer, and the ways in which these characters are portrayed are pretty harmful to the queer community, for obvious reasons, like the conflation of queerness with mental illness and violent behavior, viewing queer bodies as being horrific, monstrous, and alien, as examples. So where does this leave us? Honestly, after watching the film and kind of like reading all this information and with my background studying trans horror, I don't actually think that the character of Longlegs himself is necessarily harmful, even with his queer-coded qualities. I really just think that the genre of horror itself is just so steeped in transphobia that it's really kind of hard to separate the two. It's hard not to read the character from a transphobic lens, especially given like the explicit influence from films like Silence of the Lambs. I actually don't think that portraying the character as queer, even if there wasn't this connection to Perkins' father, was necessarily a bad move. It's just a very touchy subject, which is super fair, and it's super fair that this film is kind of up for this kind of criticism. Queerness in horror just has to kind of walk a fine line. And I do think that there is space for ambiguity when it comes to gender and sexuality. Like, what are we going to do? Just, like, police the way that characters are portrayed? Like, do all villains have to be, like, just very explicitly straight-coded? I don't think so. I know that's kind of, like, a stupid example, but there is room for this ambiguity, I think. What does make sense to me is that we do have more open conversations about this history of transphobia in horror. And also that we have more trans representation that's not so, I guess, black and white. That we have trans representation that isn't really weirdly fetishistic or violent, and instead leave space for queer characters in these films to really just exist, like, as people. That being said, there is still lots of room for, I guess, more like positive representations of trans characters in horror too. I know recently some more films have been coming out with like horror films with trans protagonists. For example, the horror slasher film They Them came out in 2022 to like really bad reviews, but it still came out. So They Them portrays a group of queer teens in a conversion therapy camp. And while the majority of teens are binary, trans, and cisgender, one character, Jordan, is non-binary and uses they, them pronouns. And while it is great here that the director, who is a cis gay man, wanted to show this representation and show queer bodies as like not being monstrous or gross, it still managed to kind of like rub me the wrong way. Like, all love to the actor Theo Germain, but I just think it's kind of funny that like there's all these queer teens and the only one who isn't binary just happens to be like skinny, androgynous white, which is like, I don't know, it's such a trope in the non-binary community. That's like the ideal non-binary body. And I think that we're kind of past that. And I think that people can do more work to kind of portray these not gender conforming bodies. Even though I think this is still important for people like Theo Germain to be booking roles and for this representation. Understanding transness as monstrous is, of course, problematic, but there's still space for characters like Longlegs, in my opinion. Now you might ask, with all this history, how can we get to a point in which characters like Longlegs, who are a bit more ambiguous and who aren't necessarily heroic figures, how can they kind of more comfortably exist in the field of horror? How can we get to this point? This would be by kind of just like normalizing queer characters as just being like complicated, real people, I guess. While there have been many, many harmful portrayals of queer and specifically trans people in cinema, having like one-dimensional queer good characters doesn't necessarily remedy the situation. We can take, for an example, if we're looking at a similar issue from a feminist lens, in Marvel, you have characters like Miss Marvel, who no one likes because she's just like a girl boss and she doesn't really have a personality and she never makes mistakes, and that kind of puts women in a weird position because I don't know many women who are actually like that, and it's not great representation. Through creating more queer characters who are more human, who don't exist only to exploit queerness for plot, characters like Longlegs, who I guess are more implicitly queer, but whose queerness is visible yet not central to the plot, may become more acceptable, as they won't simply exist alongside a long lineage of harmful and weird queer representations in the horror genre. Anyways, let me know your thoughts on Longlegs down below. Let me know your thoughts on trans horror or queer representations in horror. If you have any suggestions for films that you think I should check out, if there's any content you want me to make in the future, please let me know. And thank you so much for watching this video. If you're not subscribed to me yet, I'm trying to grow my very small channel, so if you could do that, that would help me out a lot. Yeah, thank you so much. I love you.